this lesson, we'll combine various painting and drawing mediums to create an image of sailboats. Let's first take a look at the materials we'll be using. We'll be working on 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. We'll create our initial sketch using an F graphite pencil, then we'll go over the top of that with a bit of pen and ink. We'll add watercolor washes using watercolor, and then we'll enhance the watercolor washes with a bit of gouache, which is opaque watercolor, and then we'll increase the contrast and make the colors a little bit more bold with colored pencils. We'll first begin with the graphite pencil and establish our horizon line, or basically the line where the sky meets the ground. In this case, we can't necessarily see the horizon line, but we have a good idea of where it's located. In this case, we'll place it just below halfway between the top and the bottom of the picture plane. Then we can begin sketching the basic shapes of each one of the boats. In this particular case, I'm going to condense the photo reference down into just 3 boats. We'll position 2 of them on the right side of the picture plane, and the third we'll position on the left side of the picture plane. We're not going to worry about adding any details or any indications of shadow or value at this point, just the basic contours, which are the outlines. As you can see, we can sketch quickly and loosely. In fact, the final result in this image should appear rather loose and sketchy. You'll also notice that the coarse texture of the cold-pressed watercolor paper does affect the graphite marks that we make here. Some of our marks are broken, but that's okay since we're going to be covering up all of these graphite applications with our subsequent applications of the various mediums that we're using. We'll include each of the masts, and we'll also add a few indications of some of the ropes that extend their way down from the top of the masts. Now moving on to our third boat, we'll allow a little bit of space between the first 2 that we drew and the third that we're adding. This will help balance the image a bit and create a more asymmetrical composition. Next, we'll add the small pier that extends right behind each one of the boats. We'll also add a few of the posts that extend up from each one of the piers, and also the ones that are just outside of the edge of each one of the boats. We'll add a very subtle indication of some of the distant trees. Now that we've got our initial sketch in graphite in place, we'll start to create the pen and ink drawing. We'll apply pen and ink mostly to just the boats and the pier. We'll start by just simply outlining all of the contours that we created with the graphite pencil. We can add additional details as we see them, and we can also use some subtle hatching to begin the process of developing some of the values. We can add the railings on each one of the boats using simple lines. Of course, we'll also add contour lines to each one of the masts as well. We'll allow this line to be slightly broken on the left side of each one of the masts, which are closer to the light source. The line created on the right side of the mast is a bit more solid to help to indicate a bit of shadow. Then we'll simply continue on to our second sailboat, and again, define all of the contour lines with the pen and ink applications. We'll add a few indications of some subtle details, while keeping the drawing rather loose. We'll also add additional hatching for some darker values. And here again, we'll also add some indication of some of the railing using simple lines. We'll continue working our way to our final sailboat. But before doing so, we'll give some indication of the distant pier, as well as the poles that extend their way up from the water. We're leaving out some of the details obviously here, because we want our final image to appear rather loose. Remember, it's ultimately up to you what you include in your drawing and what you leave out. We'll add a few lines coming from the poles that extend up from the water to indicate the ropes that are connected to each one of the boats. We'll add a very light line using a very light touch to indicate some of the ropes that extend down from the top of the mast. Then we'll finish off the indication of the distant pier and add a few vertical lines for some of the slats in between. Now we're ready for our watercolor applications. We'll first start using a hake brush to apply water to the entire surface. Then we'll create a mixture made up of burnt umber, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and a touch of cadmium red. Using quite a bit of water and the hake brush, we'll apply this mixture to the entire surface. Then while the surface is still wet, we'll go back and apply a slightly heavier concentration in areas around the edges of the picture plane and on the lower part of the picture plane. Now we're ready to mix up a color for the distant trees. We'll use a bit of ultramarine, a touch of sap green, and burnt umber to create this color. Then using a smaller round brush, we'll fill in the overall shape of the distant trees. We're not going to worry about details here. Instead, we just want a shape of color. As we apply this color, we'll allow for some variety in the mixture. In other words, we'll allow the ultramarine to dominate in areas and the burnt umber to dominate in areas. We'll gently lift some of the color on the left side of the tree line by adding a bit of water and then gently dabbing with a paper towel. We'll add a slight orange tint to this area by adding just a touch of burnt sienna to our mixture. And then we'll lightly glaze over the top of the trees, primarily on the left side of each collection of trees. Now I'll add a slightly stronger mixture of yellow-green by combining cadmium yellow with sap green. Then we'll start to paint in the overall shape of some of the trees that are slightly closer to the viewer. Here again, we can add a bit of water and gently dab the surface with a paper towel, which will lift up some of the color, creating some nice highlights. We can create shadows on the opposite side of the trees by mixing a bit of ultramarine with burnt umber and a touch of sap green. We'll lightly touch the surface on the shadowed side of the tree while the surface is still wet. This will encourage some bleeding and create an even transition from light to dark. We'll go ahead and add a couple more trees. We'll make the trees that are further away quite a bit lighter, and the ones that are slightly closer somewhat darker. We'll follow the same process of first applying our mixture of cadmium yellow and sap green, gently blotting the surface to create highlights, and then adding a bit of shadow on the opposite side. Using the same mixture that we used for the trees, we'll paint in an indication of the hill that is slightly off in the distance. Then once our trees have dried, we can go back with a slightly more intense application of our mixture. We'll start with the highlighted side using a heavy amount of cadmium yellow. Then we'll move on to the shadowed side, again using our mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine with just a touch of sap green. We'll add the small collection of bushes on the right side of the picture plane, again starting with our mixture of cadmium yellow and sap green with just a touch of burnt umber. Then we'll go ahead and fill in the shadows. Since this bush is closer to the viewer, the contrast in value is going to be quite a bit stronger. This means that the darker values are going to be slightly more intense. We'll bring some of these slightly more intense shadows up into the trees as well. Now we're ready to address some of the shadows on the boat. We'll start with a mixture of ultramarine and burnt umber. This time our mixture is dominated by the ultramarine, creating a cooler gray. We'll start filling in all of the shadows that we see. We'll start with light applications and progressively make them darker as each layer dries. This gives us full control over the resulting value that we create. We'll use the same mixture of colors to create all of the shadows on each of the 3 sailboats. Keep in mind that we will go back with additional media to make the contrast a little bit stronger, so we'll keep our painting light at this stage. Keeping with our mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine, we'll address the pier that's off in the distance. We'll apply a slightly darker application here, and using some of this color will also make some of the shadows on the boats a little bit stronger. We'll also apply this mixture to the shadowed side of each one of the posts, taking care to leave an area of highlight on the left side, which is closer to the light source. We'll do the same thing to each one of the masts, applying the color primarily on the right side of each one of the masts to indicate a bit of shadow. Then we can go back to the body of the boats and add a bit more shadow in areas, this time with a slightly more intense mixture. We'll also start to create some of the reflections and shadows that happen in the water. We'll keep with our same mixture of burnt umber and ultramarine to do so. Mostly, we'll use horizontal strokes to indicate the small reflections that happen in the water. They become weaker as we work our way down the picture plane. Underneath the boats, there's quite a bit of shadow that happens here, along with the reflection. As we work our way down, we're careful to leave areas of the lighter value underneath showing through. Although some control is required here, it's important to stay fairly loose with your brushstrokes. If we become too stiff with our applications, the water won't be very convincing. It'll look too controlled and manufactured. Just as we did with the core shadows on the boat, we can go back and make some of the shadows and reflections a bit stronger with additional applications. We'll slowly and patiently continue to develop additional contrast in this area by layering over progressively darker applications. Slowly, our reflections are starting to take shape. We'll add a few indications of the reflection of the masts in the water as well, further down on the picture plane. Now we're ready to add some color to the boats. We'll start here with a pure application of ultramarine. We'll add these pops of color in various locations, including the small little bumpers beside each one of the boats, and also to the sail covers. We'll make sure to use the same color on each one of the boats to create some unity in the image. We'll also apply a couple of stripes on a few of the boats using the same color. We can make a slightly darker version by adding just a touch of burnt umber. We can use this to enhance some of the shadows even further. Now we're ready to switch over to our next medium, which is gouache. Gouache is opaque watercolor. We'll use a combination of primary blue with a bit of titanium white to create a light blue. And then we'll apply this to the highlighted side of all the blue areas on each one of the boats. Gouache is very strong and very bold. It may cover up some of the pen and ink applications, but that's okay in this case. These strong pops of color will make the light stronger in the image. You may notice that as gouache dries, it dries to a slightly darker value than that of which it's first applied. This means you may have to revisit areas to make the values a little bit lighter or to make the color a bit bolder. Using a mixture of primary yellow with primary red with a touch of white, we'll add a few pops of orange. We'll also echo this orange in the reflections in the water. Now, using white, we'll go back and make the highlights much stronger. This will enhance the illusion of light within the scene. Of course, since our light source originates from the left side of the picture plane, most of these highlights will exist on the left side and the top portions of the boats, but we'll also include some of it in the water as well. We'll continue working our way across the picture plane, adding highlights to not only our first boat, but the post in the water, and then we'll begin applying highlights to our second boat. We'll also apply this to the top part of the sail that's rolled up on the middle boat. We can add a bit of the primary blue to enhance some of the lighter blues on this boat as well. And we'll do the same on our third boat. We can add just a touch of orange to our mixture to make the light feel a little bit warmer. Now we'll strengthen up the highlights on the masts using white. Now we'll add a few hints of reflection underneath the boats using our blue and white mixture of the gouache. Now let's move on to our last medium, which is colored pencils. We'll start here with an application of 90% warm gray. I'm using Prismacolor Premier pencils for this, but you can use any brand that you wish. We're going to enhance the contrast with these colored pencils and also make the colors a bit stronger. So we'll start in the shadowed areas, underneath the boats, and in the reflections of the water. Just as we did with our brush strokes early on, we'll make sure that our brush strokes here, or our pencil strokes, are mostly horizontal. We'll bounce around a bit with the colored pencil applications. Here we're enhancing some of the core shadows on the boat before revisiting some of the reflections in the water. Now we'll use a bit of Copenhagen blue and make some of our blues a bit stronger. We'll work primarily in the areas of mid-tone. And we'll be sure to echo this color in some of the reflections in the water. Now enhance a few areas using 10% French gray. This color is a very warm gray. It's very light as well. It's very close to being white, but not quite. Now we really want to make those highlights pop a bit more, so we'll switch over to a pure white colored pencil and make them quite a bit stronger. We'll also use the white in areas of the reflection as well. We'll add a few highlights to the distant pier, and also continue strengthening up the highlights on the boats. Now let's enhance the trees. We'll start here with an application of chartreuse, primarily on the side of the tree that's closest to the light source. We'll add this color to the highlighted side of the bush that's closer to the viewer, and also to the hill that's slightly behind it. Then we'll address the midtones using a bit of moss green. We can make the shadows slightly darker by using 90% warm gray. Now we'll strengthen up some of the orange by using the color called yellowed orange. We'll also echo this in the reflection. Then we'll add a few more of the blues that we see reflected in the water. We'll use Copenhagen blue, followed by a bit of sky blue light. We'll also use a bit of the sky blue light on some of the highlights on each one of the boats. Now, the texture of the paper is okay here, but I want to tone it down just a bit. So here we're going to use a colorless blender to work some of the colored pencil applications into the tooth of the paper. It won't eradicate the texture of the paper from showing through completely, but it will help to smooth some transitions between colored pencil applications. Now, let's add some additional interest and a little bit of character by adding a few paint splatters. We'll use the same mixture that we used for the background originally, which is a mixture of burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and a touch of cadmium red. And we'll create clearly a watery mixture and splatter it on using the larger round brush. We're only going to make these splatters in the corners of the picture plane. We'll make a few final adjustments and strengthen up the highlights using a white colored pencil. And now, our mixed media piece of a few sailboats is complete. If you enjoyed this video, then I know you'll love being a member at thevirtualinstructor.com. Our members have access to all of our drawing and painting courses on a variety of subjects and techniques. Each one of our video modules includes a downloadable illustrated ebook that goes along with the video. We also have weekly live lessons. All of these lessons are streamed for an hour each week on a variety of subjects and mediums, and they're recorded and stored in our library, our vault of recorded live lessons from the past. So the program just continues to grow week by week. There's also the weekly critiques, which are part of the Members Minute, where you can learn by analyzing the artworks of others. There's a year-long lesson plan for visual arts teachers that includes lesson plans, video resources, handouts, and much, much more. There's just so much involved in our unique membership program. So if you're interested in learning how to take your drawings and paintings to another level, I suggest you check out the program. Everybody starts with a trial, so you can go in and check everything out risk-free. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I wish you all the best in your artistic success.